Thank you for coming. We have a great panel this afternoon to close out our first day here on flexibility and future load. I'm Steve Dahlke. I'm a research economist with the Electric Power Research Institute. But my job today is largely to introduce our panel and get out of the way so we can hear the expert insights that our panelists have to share. So just as a heads up, we revised the order slightly from what's printed on your agendas. So this panel, we're going to start with prepared remarks from each of our panelists, about 15 minutes or so. We're going to start with Tom Hines, who's going to give us a perspective from Arizona Public Service Company and their experience with flexible load. We're going to move to Caitlin Murphy from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and she's going to talk about the value of flexible load under increasing electrification with some of her future studies that they've been working on about 20 miles west of us here from Denver over at the NREL lab in Golden. And after that, we have Derek Stenclik from Telos Energy. Derek is going to talk about flexibility needs identified in clean energy studies and give us a nice another future-looking perspective on load flexibility. And then we're going to round out the panel with Agee Springer from ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, to talk about their experience with large flexible loads, a lot that have been integrating onto their system recently, as well as what they see coming down the pike. We're going to follow these formal presentations with some moderated discussion. And again, thank you all for coming. I look forward to hearing your questions and getting into this. So I'm going to pull up Tom's presentation and we'll have him come up to the podium.
All right, thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. All right, that should be better. All right, thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I just presented over across the hall there, so there's a couple of overlap slides for folks. I see some familiar faces. So, and you guys know me from last time. I'm a fast talker. I got a lot of material I want to cover with you guys, and I'm going to try not to be too long. So, I'm going to just jump right in. Again, my name's Tom Hines. I'm an outside consultant to APS, but I've been there for 27 years. I'm the founder and principal of a company called Tierra Resource Consultants. Work with APS and a lot of other clients around like flexible capacity and really thinking about customer programs. So I talked across the hall there around how we orchestrate between TOU rates and demand response programs, because APS has a lot of customers on TOU rates, like 70%. And so that's been an important component of what we do. This session, I want to focus more on kind of how do we forecast what we think we're going to get from all of this demand side flexibility we're building? How do we do it in the short term as well as thinking about it over the long term? And so just to give you kind of a current snapshot of the APS resource mix and picture of where the utility finds itself and what the future looks like it's going to bring. First of all, increasing customer and investor demand for clean energy. APS made a commitment to 100% carbon-free by 2050. I know that's a little later than some of the Colorado utilities, but is a voluntary commitment, was not driven by any kind of state mandates or anything. And APS made that commitment in January of 2020. And so increasing demand for clean energy, which means retirement of coal plants, which have been a part of the base load in the APS system for many, many years. Meanwhile, supply chain constraints on some like large solar and storage projects, right? So trying to make up some of that supply side may take a little longer than we think. Unprecedented growth. We've got the largest current construction project in the United States, I believe, which is TSMC chip manufacturing plant. It's like a $5 billion investment right now in phase one. It's huge. The entire build out will be about a quarter of the entire load that APS serves today in terms of one facility, as well as a lot of data centers coming. So you look at that, and oh yeah, by the way, EVs and electrification. So and then rapidly changing technology, right? So challenging times to think about sustainability goals and keeping reliability and affordability. So We often talk about like DER's friend or foe, right? Because some of these things are driven by challenges caused by DERs, but we see DERs really and customer-sited technologies and distributed energy resources as a significant part of the solution going forward. This is from the 2020 IRP that APS did, and you'll see that number one, we're serving a lot more energy in 2035 than we did in 2020. And then when you look at the energy mix, a couple of things to point out. Coal goes away, and then you see a lot more utility scale solar and a lot more utility scale storage. And then the other big chunk that increases is demand side and microgrids and all things that are really customer-sited technologies that represent in 2035 about 1/4 of APS's resource mix to meet the resource needs for the state of Arizona in their territory. So a really significant sea change in terms of how we're going to meet energy needs going forward. So this is a slide I shared across the hallway that we're using all of these techniques to try to think about ways that we can drive and encourage greater load flexibility from customers. First of all, thinking about awareness of behavior and manual interactions, but driving those really more as much around now affordability, as much around clean now as affordability and reliability. And also being driven more by technologies. I showed a slide across the hall of real-time home energy monitors. That's a new program that APS is doing. And that's very much designed to encourage customers who are, by and large, have already adopted time differentiated rates to understand how they can shift their loads and what their peak consumption is doing in ways that they can shift those loads off peak to save money, save energy, and drive the clean. And then direct dispatch, of course, but we also use rate responsiveness in a very big way because we have so many customers on TOU rates. And we're believers that if we do it right, these two things can kind of row together and help customers better understand how DR events work, why they're called, and kind of be a DR resource for us every day in terms of rate responsiveness. Overlaid on top of all that rate responsiveness, though, we talked about the need for more granularity, more flexibility, right? Less static ways that we can create flexible capacity. And so built over top of that set of TOU rates, and in part influenced and supported by those TOU rates, is one of the largest aggregated DER device programs in the nation when you add it all together, and particularly for a very mid-sized utility with about a little over 1 million customers. We've built this over the last 5 years. We've increased by about 400% over the last 5 years in terms of what kind of capacity we can bring. I won't go into all these in great detail. As a matter of fact, I'll talk mostly about thermostats in terms of how we're predicting and forecasting what flexible capacity is available. And I want to share with you guys that for the Cool Rewards program, it's a residential driven program. There is small business in it, but it's mostly residential thermostats. And in that program, we want to make sure that customers understand in Phoenix, Arizona in the summer that they always maintain control of their thermostat. That means they can opt out of any event at any time. And you are not going to scale up a program in Phoenix by telling customers, we're going to take control of your thermostat when it's 115 out. So we've tried to balance the customer side with also then the understanding of like, that means it's less firm. And so how do we forecast it? How do we predict it? How do we know it's there when we need it? And so I'm going to talk about all those things. I'm going to mostly focus on thermostats because that's been by far the biggest piece of this virtual power plant we've built. But we are quickly adding batteries. We've added 700 over the last 8 months into the program, over 4 megawatts currently online in our pilot, scaling our peak solutions, commercial DR, and things like connected water heating. And I didn't put EVs on here, just really getting started with that after waiting for some regulatory approvals. And really driving ahead with that quickly, pun intended. So with all of these, I wanted to kind of talk about what's the data that we're using to be confident in our forecasts, our potential studies, our implementation, our day of, right? A lot of my focus is actually from today through the next 5 years. It's like, what are we going to innovate in the portfolio? I do work with resource planners on a 15 and 20-year horizon, but most of the work I'm focused on is innovating programs to drive participation and drive capacity for the next 4 or 5 years, because that is a real need for the system right now. So we really focused about 6 years ago. We had done what a lot of utilities did with all our energy efficiency programs. We had a peak demand, a coincident peak number in terms of capacity savings, and we had an annual savings number in kilowatt hours for energy efficiency. Now, for every single program in the portfolio, whether it's energy efficiency or demand response or some other load shifting program, we collect 8760 hourly load profiles for every hour of the year. And we do that through a combination of using AMI data, residential at 1 hour intervals, commercial at 15-minute intervals. We use end-use metering, and we've done a lot of studies. We've got about 200 homes that have participated in a continuous end-use metering study for about 3 years. As they add things, we're able to see those. We're looking at every circuit in the home with e-gauges. We're using device telemetry data. And the example on the top right is device telemetry from thermostats. And that's actually thermostats just following our time of use rates. That's not a demand response event. You can see that actual capacity reduction and load following demand response there just from rates. So we use device telemetry from all those different devices on the slide, and then energy modeling. And in addition, a lot of customer survey of participants, right? It'd be great if we could get a lot of impact, but not so great if nobody wants to participate in the program, right? So we do really focus on making customers happy and comfortable and making it what we call frictionless experience for participating in programs. But then all of that stuff is built into a set of data sets, tools, and metrics that we use. And I'll start with kind of metrics, because I think that's where really that's the objective, is we're trying to think about all of our energy impacts at hourly and sub-hourly level, both energy and capacity peak, and more thinking about low load conditions. We have to think about cost effectiveness from the standpoint of regulatory, and all our EE and DSM programs have to pass the societal cost test. We definitely look at emissions and ways that we can shift load around intermittent renewables to move forward with our clean energy goals. And then, of course, customer sat that we just talked about. All of that is driven into data sets. So thinking about those hourly DSM load shapes, we use APS dispatch and load forecast to try to think about things like emissions and when is it important, when can we reduce ramp rates, things like that. When does DSM matter? Of course, avoided energy and capacity costs, customer retail rates, because we're always thinking, by the way, we assume every customer participating in demand response is on TOU rate, because 70% of customers are, and we don't want to get that wrong. So we just assume everyone is. And so we're thinking about retail rates. And every time we do a load shape, we also pass that load shape in front of every retail rate, because we have several options to think about how does this use case and our use case on the grid impact customers and their rates. And we have a hold harmless provision that says we don't want to ever drive up costs without compensating the customer at least that much in our incentives. And then finally, just kind of the technology and program costs, right? So this is a slide. So by the way, we use Energy Hub as an aggregator for our thermostats. They're also aggregating batteries for us. We use a different provider for our water heating program, and we're still looking for who we're going to use for electric vehicles. But I stole this slide from Energy Hub because I thought that it was a kind of a neat concept for this organization and this group. So thinking of how we go from the theoretical maximum that I could get, which represents like baseline load. What's your total load from that device? Let's say it's a thermostat, and that's what this was built around. Let's say it's a thermostat. So ultimately the end use is HVAC. And so the baseline load is the maximum I could reduce in capacity is if I were to reduce 100% of that HVAC load. In summer in Phoenix, people wouldn't like that very much. So we don't do that. But we think about controllability as sort of the neck as we start down the funnel, right? So the first thing is connectivity. And we've gotten smarter about not incenting customers who aren't connected, right? And thinking about when we time our incentive payments and how much we kind of coach customers to make sure they're connected. Compatibility. Sometimes you'll call a device and it will be not in the right mode, not in a cooling mode, right? So we see that sometimes, particularly with high country thermostats in the summer. Dispatch access or dispatch success. And that's really on Energy Hub and the OEM side. And we have SLAs built around that now because that's something that our provider is responsible for, is that dispatch success. And then control duration simply means how long did we control? How long did we mean to control? And then did some people opt out and when? Because most importantly, what we find is we see about 12, 13, 15% opt-outs on events. They're typically in the last 30 minutes of the event. So we got most of the value from those thermostats actually, and that's a really important concept. And then finally, parameter factors, which are kind of around the parameters of an event itself. So the event length, the degree offset, the pre-cool length and offset, all of those things when put together go into this forecast of what do we think we're going to get from this type of event on this day with this set of customers in this platform. And we are using it for reliability. So we want to make sure it's a reliable resource. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I'm running out of time. But we use Cool Rewards regionally to help with net peaks on the grid. And you'll see how it's after the total grid peak as solar starts to come down. We're integrated with EIM. And so this is really coming straight from CAISO. That's when we're calling events, is say that 5 to 8 p.m. window when we see all that solar come off the grid. When a lot of snapback is happening, our TOU rate period ends at 7 p.m. So we're doing a lot of events in that kind of a time frame. And so we need them to be there when we want them. This is the best example of concerns from our marketing and trading folks that said, but we could never call like 4 events in 5 days when it's 110 to 120 during all those days. And we did. And we had to. This was blackouts in California during this time. And what we found was really reliable response. We saw slightly higher opt-outs on the last couple of events, but overall, it didn't really change a lot, the total impact we were able to get. This was in 2% or 3% of our forecast too. And then what we're working on right now, and this is a slide from Energy Hub also, is within their platform across all their clients. We've done a lot of this at APS. Within their platform this summer, later this summer, they're going to be rolling out a new forecast that says, if you were to call this type of event with these aggregated devices right now, this is what you would get, or tomorrow or any other day of the week. So this is what we do. We're going to be using hopefully for like very much, day of and day ahead forecast. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of these slides and then I'll be done. We are currently doing a demand response potential study, and I thought this would be helpful in terms of thinking how we think about flexible capacity and how we predict it and forecast it. So starts with characterizing the market based on total loads by class and subclass of customers and building type. Then we develop kind of a count and a peak demand projection for each one of those, because we recognize that different customer segments have different flexibility, right? So we try to break down load into all those different buckets, and I'll show you that. We define a set of DR options that I'm going to show you on the next slide for different subgroups, subsegments of customers. The one I'll show is for C&I. And then we develop key assumptions for that DR: participation, flexibility, cost, what we need to pay in incentives. And then we estimate potential and cost and develop a benefit cost equation from that. And I'm going quickly here, but DR options and sub options, I won't go through these in detail. I just wanted you to see the granularity that that's how we're thinking about this, is not only sort of, these are all the things in curtailment or direct load control, and then a lot of different flavors of program design under that. Who are the eligible customer classes? And then what are the end uses that I'm targeting and that I'm thinking I'm going to be able to control? And then this really leads into a slide that I thought was really helpful for this group to say, we've looked at prior participation, and we're also looking ahead and looking at benchmarking across utilities at how much flexibility do we get today from that particular customer segment? How much do we think is available? And what generally is sort of a steady state, percent flexibility of load for different subsegments of customers within commercial? I was scared to even present this because it is super preliminary. This is just more of an illustration of approximately what this study is going to be telling us. This is not final. But what I wanted to point out is that the makeup of these things changes drastically over this study. I've done a few of these over the years, and this is the one that's been the most interesting and exciting when you look at the back end of this study being all about batteries and EVs. And so we're already thinking about program designs for those, and there will be a different world we're trying to solve at that point. So current on the horizon, coordinating with EIM on our load adjustments, because they were not actually taking our demand response load adjustments in to our forecasts. And we want to make sure that those are included in our forecast. We're creating stronger SLAs with our aggregation partners to make sure they're doing everything they can. Despite letting customers opt out, they need to be able to do what they can to make sure that events are conducted reliably, better predictive forecasting we talked about, better orchestration now across DER types as we bring in batteries and EVs, and lower latency and quicker data transfer. And so with that, that was a very quick tour of how we look at load flexibility at APS, and I will turn it over to Steve. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Tom, for that window into APS's operations and what you're working on. In our revised order, we are next going to hear from Caitlin Murphy at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And I'm pulling up her presentation right now.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. Hi, thank you very much for the opportunity to come present today. I'm going to talk about some results from our electrification future study, focusing on the value of flexibility that we see more from the utility or the grid operator perspective. So I'll use this slide both as kind of an overview of this multi-year study, but also as the outline for my presentation today. So the electrification future study sought to explore 5 questions listed in order here. First, we wanted to understand how might electrification impact electricity demand and use patterns. So a lot of what we just covered on the previous panels today, thinking about vehicle electrification and electrification of building services, as well as some industrial electrification. We then took that load information and tried to understand what does that mean from a grid planning perspective? How much capacity do we need to meet that load, and of what types under different assumptions, including both generation as well as transmission and storage investments on the bulk power system level. From those mixes that we developed from our least cost capacity expansion modeling, we then performed some operational modeling, tried to understand how we might operate the system a little bit differently given these different load shapes and the evolving mix of assets that we have to meet those loads across the country. So all national scale in this study. And then the focus for today, and one of the main sort of original findings of our study, is really thinking about the role and the value of demand side flexibility. In this case, I'm really just talking about load shifting, so not all of the use cases that Tom just presented. Also talking about kind of that direct dispatch operational mode that he mentioned. So not focusing on the direct incentive mechanism, but more if the utility had perfect control over the loads that we have defined as being flexible, how would they dispatch those loads to try to minimize their planning and operational costs? And then finally, I won't talk about it too much today, but we have a few publications and data resources that summarize how this all comes together in terms of the total impacts on costs, benefits, emissions, environmental impacts, things like that. Again, all at a national scale, so thinking across the whole country. So I'll just walk through those first couple of points because I think it's important context when I talk about the potential and value of flexibility. We're talking about a very different future than what we have today. And I know that we've already seen this chart earlier in one of the other panels, but what we're talking about relative to the historical kind of flat demand growth over the past decade, under our high electrification scenario, you're seeing this dramatic increase in load over the next 30 years or so. Most of it is that blue wedge, which corresponds to transportation electrification. So when we think about just annual electricity demand, most of it's coming from EVs, the growth that we see going forward under our scenarios. Of course, we also see changes to the timing of the demand, and that can lead to both higher and sharper and more frequent peaks by 2050. This is from a combination of vehicle charging, but also space heating and cooling demands across the country, starting to see the emergence of both potentially dual peaks depending on the season, but also a shift into more winter peaking, depending on which part of the country you're in. So this is a comparison between 2015 on the left and 2050 on the right. The pie chart in each state shows the peak demand, the top 100 hours in each state. The shading tells you the timing of that demand. So the warmer shades indicate summer and fall peaking, mostly air conditioning load, especially in 2015. Most parts of the country are summer peaking, with the exception of the Northwest and a little bit in the Southeast as well, where you do see some high demand periods in the winter for resistive heating systems in particular. When we think about the evolving technology mix for lots more EVs, switching over to electric space heating, electric water heating as well, looking forward in time, not accounting for some of the climate change impacts we were talking about in an earlier session, what we see is both an increase in the size of the pie, but also a change in the color. So everywhere across the country, we're seeing an increase in the amount of peak demand. It's an increase on the order of about 33% relative to 2015 levels, but we're also seeing more and more of these blue wedges emerging. So we're starting to see more and more winter peaking, and this is really driven primarily by electric space heating in our assumed load shapes and load profiles across the country based on customer adoption. What this means from a grid planning perspective, so thinking about electricity generation and transmission capacity, is the need to install a lot of new generation capacity, both to replace existing retiring generation assets, but also to meet these growing load profiles. This is pretty similar to a slide we saw from Jesse earlier, driven by very different factors in this case, but similar themes overall. You're seeing the addition of a lot of solar in yellow, a lot of wind in blue, and then the assets at the bottom are natural gas fired generation. In this case, we haven't assumed the Inflation Reduction Act isn't included in this. For example, no carbon policy. This was just a business as usual case from a couple of years ago. But in general, we're talking about a huge increase relative to historical additions, partially because we're talking about lower capacity factor resources, but also because we're trying to meet that dramatic increase in load due to vehicle electrification primarily. In terms of operational impacts, we took those generation mixes. We actually ran through a number of different assumptions. So business as usual, low cost renewables. There was a carbon policy case in there as well with 80% decarbonization by 2050. And we ran those scenarios through some of our operational models, also run by NREL. And really what we were trying to look for here is, are we still meeting our loads reliably? The punchline here is that yes, we are serving the vast majority of load under all of the different conditions that we considered, including none of the load being flexible, so relatively pessimistic load shapes, but also relying very heavily on renewable generation in some of our cases, so weather dependent resources, and the same was true in our more natural gas fired generation resource mixes as well. But all of that was really just context for what I wanted to focus on today, which is the demand side flexibility piece and the value that it can provide, both in terms of a planning and operational context. So what I would say the main point of my presentation is not the findings, it's not the answers, it's more about the methods. And I think it really tracks nicely with what Tom just presented in terms of the level of detail you need to really capture the potential for this demand side flexibility and the value that it offers. So in our study, we defined 14 different types of shiftable loads. This ranged from residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation options. We broke it down by end use service in particular. So HVAC is treated differently than dishwashers, is treated differently than electric dryers, for example, in the household. Commercial HVAC is different than residential HVAC. And then light duty vehicles are treated differently than medium and heavy duty vehicles. Then for each of those end uses, we had to define the timing that flexibility could be provided, how long that flexibility could be provided, how many customers we think can feasibly participate and how many are likely to actually participate. And then the capacity to, which direction you would like to shift that load. Are you talking about shifting it forward in time, backward in time? Either really depends on the end use and what people are willing to accommodate. Air conditioning in Arizona, for example, we're not going to just shut off for 4 hours in the middle of the day. That's a relatively small window that we're going to define that flexibility. But vehicle charging might be more flexible. People might be willing to allow that shifting to happen over the course of many hours, potentially just needing to balance that load over the course of a week, as long as they know their car will be full at the end of that week, for example. So once we have this parameterized and defined, we can layer that with different levels of electrification and try to understand how electrification might unlock additional sources of flexibility. So what we show here is a comparison of kind of a business as usual case on the left and then our high electrification case on the right. And then it goes residential, industrial, commercial, and transportation is sort of the potential flexible loads within those scenarios. So under our business as usual case on the left, residential flexibility is the main source of flexibility from the grid perspective. When we shift into high electrification, we actually see very little change in those top 3 bars. That's partially because these are very efficient equipment that we're adopting in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, partially because we don't see the potential for a lot of participation within the industrial sector in particular, for example, where they're much more sensitive to having to shift their loads to inopportune times. And then partially because these are already heavily electrified sectors. There's not as much potential for additional load and additional flexibility to show up. Where there's a really big impact is in the blue bar at the bottom, where the widespread adoption of electric vehicles can really unlock a significant amount of potential flexibility if it's properly designed and incentivized for the customer to participate in these programs. So what does it mean and how is it actually operationalized in our operational models? So this is really a system-wide optimization. It's the grid operator perspective. It's assuming kind of direct dispatch of those loads and complete control over which way they want to move it and how much they move. And this is kind of a high-level summary from a national scale perspective. So I think the modes of flexibility will really depend on where you are in the country, what your resource mix looks like, the timing of your demand, for example. But if we look at a summary across the entire country, the top chart here is 1 day. This is January 3rd in 2050, highly simulated. And this is our high renewable energy scenario. So mostly lots of renewable energy on the system, but of course, we're still relying on natural gas in this one case. And then the bottom chart is showing how we're dispatching the various sources of flexibility that are available. So the above the line means that that's where the original load was, and that's what we are shifting into whatever the below the line figure looks like on the bottom. So ultimately, the mode that we're talking about in this case, from the least cost perspective of the grid operator, is shifting that load out of those peak periods and into the middle of the day to soak up the additional renewable energy generation that's available in this scenario. So this has a variety of benefits. This is just a couple of examples of what basically the drivers for why the operational model is shifting the load in the way that it is. So on the left-hand side is looking at the commitment and operation of our fuel-based resources in this case, so coal on top and natural gas on the bottom. The yellow is showing the committed capacity, and then the red is showing how it's actually used day to day. Hour to hour in this case, because it's a relatively short window. Ultimately, the demand side flexibility is used to reduce startups and shutdowns of these fuel-based resources, also reduce some of the ramping in those resources as well. So that helps reduce the total operational cost of the generation mix, providing benefits both to the coal fleet and to the natural gas fleet in this case. That's also summarized on the right-hand side here. The impact is much higher on the natural gas units. Those are the ones that are maybe doing more startups and shutdowns during the throughout the year if this flexibility is not made available to the model, for example. But in either case, both resources are really benefiting from this. In the bottom right, maybe the bigger impact and something that we would expect under kind of an Inflation Reduction Act future is the benefits in terms of avoiding curtailment. So what we're looking at here is the impacts of increasing flexibility and the avoided curtailment month to month throughout the year. We see the biggest impacts during the spring period, which makes sense, just thinking about the total demand in that period of time and the available renewable resources, kind of that misalignment with the available generation, but also the magnitude of the load overall. But we do see this impact throughout the year, a little bit less of a benefit during the summer months when we're already using a lot of that renewable generation to meet our loads. The final point I'll make about the benefits of demand side flexibility or the value of demand side flexibility in our modeling is that it does shift the price duration curve, if you will, or reduces the price volatility that we're seeing from this, not a retail rate perspective, but more of kind of a wholesale energy price perspective. Allowing this flexibility avoids the startup or the startup of some of these higher cost resources, reduces some of the marginal prices during parts of the year. So it's shifting from that yellow curve to the pink, avoiding some of this steeper increase in the price or the higher frequency of high price periods throughout the year. So just to summarize, I really focused on the benefits of demand side flexibility when it comes to grid operations. But if we look across the electrification future study, We do see that demand side flexibility or flexible loads have the potential to reduce bulk electric system costs, partially by avoiding some of the investment that would be needed otherwise. So moving some of these loads avoids the need for the same amount of total investment in generation. That's a relatively small cost savings when we compare it to what we just focused on in the operational side of things, where operational costs were reduced by up to 10% in sort of the most extreme assumptions that we had in terms of both the generation mix, the amount of electrification and the amount of flexible loads that are available. So the maximum benefit we saw was on the order of about a 10% savings in operational costs. Part of the other benefit, though, is thinking about the emissions impacts. You know, if this is uncontrolled and you're just thinking about it from a purely minimizing operational cost perspective, you might actually increase emissions by increasing the utilization of your coal-fired power plants, for example, running them at a slightly higher level and more consistently. But under a more decarbonized grid in the future, we would see the benefits of avoided curtailment, more utilization of those renewables rather than potentially having misalignment in the timing of when those resources are available and when the demand is being called upon. And then finally, on the previous slide, I just highlighted the potential to reduce price volatility, potentially translating into impacts for the customers. A couple of caveats I want to just conclude with. This is really focused on the value of flexibility. So we assumed that this flexibility could be unlocked without any cost. The model can just use it because it has been enabled. So this is not meant to be, here's the potential for flexibility. It's more meant to be, if I can achieve this much value, that provides a little bit of an envelope for how much I might want to invest to make this possible. So I'm investing in this to achieve this level of value associated with it and thinking about it from both the capacity and the generation or energy side of things. A couple of other caveats, we're not covering all the different sources of flexibility that could be out there. We're not thinking about large industrial loads being added to the system and whether those could be operated more flexibly, for example. And potentially, you know, we're treating these as 100% firm resources. So we have not thought about, or we have not accounted for anyway, customer participation and whether it's 100% reliable that they will participate in this. So lots of important caveats, but hopefully this is a helpful introduction to what we see as the value of flexibility from the grid perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin, for that, those insights into your electrification futures. Up next with our revised order is Derek Stenclik from Telos Energy. Like Caitlin, Derek has also gazed into his crystal ball and has some interesting things to tell us about what the future might hold.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. And we got time there. All right. So the big question here, is it a crystal ball or is it the rear view mirror? I want to give a little bit of a contrarian view here to the rest of the folks on the panel, hopefully stir the pot a little bit right before happy hour. That is the point. We need to give people something to talk about and start a debate. I always like debates during the happy hour here. So the question is, when we think about load flexibility, when we talk about all these programs, are we looking into the future and kind of using our crystal ball and imagining what that future looks like? And we see huge opportunities for load flexibility, or are we kind of looking into the rear view mirror and trying to solve a problem that was there, that's there today, or maybe that was there in the past, but might not be there in the future? And I'll give, again, a little bit of a contrarian view here on what types of load flexibility we should be looking for. My personal view is flexibility is going to get a lot less important in the future. And that's a pretty contrarian view. And so I'll talk you through why I see that and what's stemming from that. So this is a chart that came from the Brattle study that was just released a couple months ago, the value of virtual power. And it shows kind of their value of DER on a net load profile. And they talk about the RA, the resource adequacy benefits that different load flexibility can bring. We talked about behind the meter batteries and smart water heating, smart thermostat, and it's a really effective resource at clipping that peak demand risk and shifting some of that to the middle of the day when we have a lot of resources available. So certainly a large benefit. But in that, they also show the battery storage profile. Looks very similar, right? We have two competing resources that are going after the same pie. right? It's this net peak load reduction, shifting load to the middle of the day. You're getting very similar behavior, very similar use case, whether you're getting it from the load side or the battery side. And I'm not going to argue which one is better, which one is cheaper, but I will argue that I think the batteries are going to win the fight, and they're going to win that battle kind of hands down. So I want to use a case study from PNM that we are just completing, should be out soon. We did this with Grid Lab, where we looked at load flexibility in a future high electrification case. And to do this, we developed bottoms up load forecasts by end use segment. So this was important. It's weather dependent. So we came up with weather dependent HVAC loads, weather dependent water heating, light duty vehicles for each weather year, and ran it through a resource adequacy simulation. And we did that at high electrification. And we also did it with high levels of flexibility. So looking at numbers kind of in the 35% of that load being flexible, we could move it around. We base this on the NREL high electrification futures work around losses and duration, things like that. And what we found is it could be a really useful substitute here in the table on the bottom. It could be a really useful substitute to reducing that storage need. So when we look at it compared to a 4-hour or 8-hour or 10-hour battery resource, we saw we could reduce that need from 1,500 megawatts down to 950 megawatts. But there's a big takeaway. What we were really trying to do with the load flexibility is understand, could we reduce the amount of firm capacity on the system? And when I say firm, kind of in this case was coming from either hydrogen CTs or geothermal or multi-day energy storage. And what we found is we couldn't reduce the firm need. It was just a substitute for that battery storage need. And I think there's something to be said. Well, that's a great finding. That's what we want load flexibility to do, is reduce that need. But let's kind of walk through this in a little bit more detail. So this is an example from that. It's on a summer day. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the load flexibility that we're getting out of the end uses. So you can see periods where it's negative, that's where we're reducing load, and it's colored by segment. So the dark blue is EV charging, the light blue is HVAC, the green is water heating, and we move that to the middle of the day. On the right-hand side, we see the original load shape, evening peak period where there's risk, and the red is unserved energy. So we have an unserved energy resource adequacy event, and you can see we shift the solid line, we shift load out of that period and into the middle of the day. Again, we have a really narrow window where there's unserved energy. It's a summer evening peak. It's kind of what we've always thought about as the problem on the system, but it is increasingly not going to be the problem on the system. And reliability risk is shifting quickly to the winter. And what I've been saying over and over and over again is winter is the new summer. So if we're thinking about these hot summer afternoon periods in the future, we're not going to be concerned about those. We're going to be concerned about the winter cold snaps. We're already seeing that crop up. It's going to become more and more and more important. So as we throw on a ton of solar, like we were seeing in the NREL electrification futures, a ton of solar and storage, that's really good at mitigating that summer peak risk. There's still going to be gaps, particularly in the winter cold snaps. And this is periods where there's a multi-day low renewables high load period. So when these cold snaps come, it typically elevates load, not just for a few hours in the afternoon, but a sustained period. And there's higher probability of multi-day wind and solar droughts. And so what happens is we end up in just an energy drought. There's not enough energy in the day. It doesn't have to do with what hours in the day there's a problem. It's just across the day. And so you can see that over on the chart on the right, where the red unserved energy is now spanning across the entire day. There's maybe a little bit of opportunity in the middle of the day because there's still some solar, but now our risk is shifted. It's across the entire day. So you just think the load flexibility in that case is diminished on how much it can help. And so my kind of crystal ball is the battery storage ship has sailed. So I'm not saying whether load flexibility or battery storage, which one is better. My personal view is I think the battery storage ship is sailing. Load flexibility just didn't get to market fast enough. And I think we're going to see a future where there's so much storage on the system, and particularly 4-hour storage, that it cannibalizes the load flexibility market. Why is that? I think first of all, storage is being built for multiple use cases. So regardless of the resource adequacy benefits, regardless of the load, the ancillary service benefits, which they bring, they're just being built because we're putting on a lot of solar onto the system, a lot of wind, and it's going to be really hard to add solar if it doesn't come with storage in the future. So it's also just kind of one on the technical maturity scale. It's fast to deploy at scale. So, I mean, we're seeing numbers, gigawatts and gigawatts can go in at a time. I mean, we are hitting supply chain, but I think it can just get to market a little bit faster. It's easier to finance, things like that. So again, my personal view, we'll see if that actually plays out. And there's some just numbers. If you look, just depending on whose forecast you look at here, this forecast is looking by the end of 2024. This is projects that are announced, financed, under construction, 25 gigawatts across the country. That's just a massive amount. And if you compare it to the scale that we would need on the load flexibility, it's just going to be really hard to bring load flexibility that far, that fast. And so we did a case study in Hawaii where this is playing out today in real time. You can see the chart here. It shows capacity additions by type, by decade. And you can just see what happened in the 2010s, a lot of rooftop PV, and what's happening now. And typically in the next couple of year or two, we're going to see a massive addition to utility scale solar and storage. And so let's look at Oahu. It's about 70% of Hawaii's load. It has an evening peak of 1,100 megawatts. Very soon, it is going to have about 600 megawatts of battery storage. Like not 5 years out, not 10 years out, like a year or two. And so we're already at that point where we've saturated that peak period. At the same time, though, there's a proposal around there for a new time of use rate to get load out of the evening. And so this is planned to be a default rate for all customers at some point, and it uses a 3-to-1 price ratio. So that peak load window has a 3x cost of midday, 60 cents per kilowatt hour in that evening peak. It's a lot of money. The question is, how much does it move the needle for system benefits? And so we wanted to look at that. So this is some work that we did with Sean, who's on the last panel. And we looked at, again, this idea that the system is becoming energy constrained. So we did a few different portfolios. I like to call it last year's scenario. So this is literally last year. It had a large coal plant online, no storage on the system yet. And then I call it next year. It might actually be like 2 years, but very, very near term. And you can see last year, the chart on the right is where we saw unserved energy by hour of the day. And it was confined to that evening peak. Again, this is what we're typically accustomed to. This is the risk everybody's worried about today. But if you look at the next year, that just spreads out. It spreads out across the entire day. It spreads out to different months and seasons. And so again, a very different need in terms of load flexibility as the storage kind of cannibalizes that peak demand or peak load period. And so we looked at this in resource adequacy analysis. We looked at 22 years of weather data, a lot of outage draws on the generators, and we ran through 500 years of simulation. And we did that again with no load shifting and looked and measured the loss of load expectation. And then we did it with this time of use rate. Again, we wanted to look at that 3-to-1 time of use. And we saw it kind of historically, that time of use rate, if we got 20% of the residential load to be flexible, we saw that to be equivalent to about 38 megawatts of perfect capacity, and which is not insignificant for Hawaii. But that's, again, that's on last year's system. If you do that on next year's system, that squashes down to 6 megawatts. So again, we're seeing battery storage already eating into that pie. And this is just a visual of why that happens. Fundamentally, we get to this low solar day that's really problematic. And you can see on kind of last year's system that load flexibility can still kind of move stuff around. It's not necessarily detrimental to reliability. When you get to next year's system, look at the gray, which is kind of essentially the net load curve after solar, wind, and storage comes out. It's already perfectly flat. There's really no benefit to move things around within the day. And so if you end up with a low solar event during that period, you might not want to shift load into the middle of the day anymore. So what other opportunities are there on load flexibility? So we ran that same case with in Hawaii, looking at the resource adequacy benefits, and we said, well, let's look at that low solar day again. But now instead of moving load around within the day, what if we could move load across days in that week? And you can see that low solar day in the middle of the week where there's unserved energy. And we looked at it, well, what if you could shift load within the week? And you saw there significant benefits still. So if you can get load out of the day entirely, not shifted around within a day, there can still be some significant benefits there. So if we're not looking for that peak net load reduction anymore, if that's not the flexibility, if battery storage kind of wins that race, where should we be looking for load flexibility? And so I came up with 4 here. The first is, let's not forget about energy efficiency. Again, what we're trying to do is, the amount, if we can just reduce load across the entire year, that helps us get to higher and higher renewable levels as a percentage of the total, just helps us reduce the total amount of capacity we need on the system. So that's always helpful. The second is around circuit level constraints. And the last panel was really about kind of EVs and this overloading on the local distribution system. I think there's still a big opportunity for load flexibility to defer that type of investment. But again, very different than this bulk system net load risk. The third is around this multi-day load resource. So again, we're going to have high energy days in the future and low energy days in the future. And we're not going to be as concerned about moving load from the evenings to the middle of the day. What we are going to be concerned about is moving load out of a day entirely. And so I think that, like, think of a cloud, instead of a time of use rate, think of a cloudy day rate, right? We want to get load out of the solar days, or low solar days altogether. And then lastly, kind of tease up the next panel presentation with Agee pretty well, is I think large flexible loads tick a lot of these boxes as well. So when we think about data centers, Bitcoin, hydrogen production, I really think that could significantly change the way we think about planning and resource adequacy. Because now we're not planning to the peak load anymore, we're planning to an average load, and these resources, if they need to, can drop out for an extended period of time and provide that energy reduction in those low renewable days altogether. So again, I think the important thing here is not that load flexibility is not needed, not helpful, not beneficial. It's just, it's competing in some sense against the battery storage for that peak demand reduction. So if that is the case, where are other opportunities? And I think these 4 is where I hope we can start kind of thinking about for the next phase. And with that, I will pass it over to Agee.
Thank you very much, Derek. All right, rounding out our panel in terms of formalized prepared remarks is Agee Springer from ERCOT, who's going to give us some insights into their experience with large flexible loads. Agee, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Can you all hear me in the back? So yeah, my name is Agee Springer. I'm the manager of large flexible load interconnection at ERCOT, and thanks to Derek for kind of teeing it up. I'll be talking very much about these large utility scale loads that we're seeing come into ERCOT. This talk, I'll just say, is a little bit more operational focus than long-term load forecasting focus. But I encourage you to kind of think of it as part 1 of 2. And I'll be back in the morning to address some of those topics. And what I'm talking about today kind of feeds into that. So I'll give a little bit of background about ERCOT and about the types of loads that we're seeing. And then I'm going to talk about some operational topics that are impacting real-time reliability kind of right now. And some of the needs that we have for improving that situation in the future. I think most folks here are fairly familiar with the ERCOT region, but ERCOT is the operator of the Texas electric grid. I'm not going to go through all the stats in the slide, except for I want to focus in on the peak load that we're seeing. So that's about 80,000 last July. I expect we will break that, if not this week, then sometime later this summer. But, you know, being an independent grid, that gives you a sense of scale of how large the Texas grid is relative to either the Eastern or Western interconnections. And when you start having large amounts of utility scale load, the operational impacts I'm going to talk about really are felt much more acutely than in either of the other interconnections. So keep that 80,000 number in your head. In terms of how we define large load and flexible load, so ERCOT considers an aggregate load of 75 megawatts or greater behind a single point of interconnection to be a large load. And if it's co-located with a generation resource, that number drops to 20. And that's because that's the point where we kind of consider there to be a material impact on the generation resource. Loads that can raise or lower their consumption either in response to price or other grid conditions are considered to be a flexible load. And there's really a pretty wide range. I want to talk about this in some more detail, but you know, some of these loads are registered with ERCOT as load resources and actually provide ancillary services, or a few participate in the economic dispatch. Many others are completely outside of the economic dispatch and adjust consumption without any direction from or coordination with ERCOT. And that's where we start to get into the reliability concerns. In terms of what has come to ERCOT, there are kind of two key metrics that we're really thinking about right now. The first is the time to interconnect. So, you know, how long from the moment the customer requests their first studies to the moment they close the breaker and begin taking power, how long is that? And the other is how sensitive is that load to either, you know, generally real-time load zone prices, but, you know, how sensitive are they to price? And so, you know, ERCOT's had large load before it was, you know, ERCOT as it exists today. Those were typically industrial facilities, long timelines to interconnect, 3 to 5 years, little price sensitive behavior. There are some industrial loads that do have some price sensitivity, but generally they're much more process driven. So, you know, once their process has started, they can't turn on and off in response to prices compared to some of the other loads we're seeing. More recent loads in the last couple of years are very different. They're much faster to interconnect to the grid, you know, months to maybe 2 years at the most. Mostly crypto mining data centers, some electrification of oil load, and a variety of sensitivity to prices. So the crypto mines are the much more sensitive ones. Data centers tend to prioritize uptime and are, you know, we're seeing them be less sensitive, but they all kind of fall in that left half of the chart. And then looking out into the future, we're seeing, you know, more data centers and some crypto probably, but also the advent of hydrogen production and electric fuel production. And that kind of fills out the whole chart because we're expecting the hydrogen to be much more like a traditional industrial load and how long they take to come to the grid, but probably more flexible than industrial loads we've seen in the past. So, you know, by the next 5 to 10 years, we're really going to see kind of a wide range of large loads on the system. And these newer loads really present a couple of distinct challenges. You know, very short timelines to interconnect, months rather than years. That's kind of faster than any of the traditional system planning processes we have can deal with. That's to plug my own talk for tomorrow. That's what I'll be kind of addressing then. So we're not going to really get into it today. But the other is the sensitivity to prices. These loads, like I said, are very fast moving, especially the crypto. So they can ramp hundreds of megawatts each in 60 to 90 seconds to a few minutes. I mean, it's you know, much faster than anything we've seen before. And that can be a challenge to reliability. Lastly, just a couple of quick stats. ERCOT's tracking almost 42 gigawatts of requests for the faster than 2 years to interconnect load. Bunch of asterisks there. Not all of that's going to be built. We don't have a good way to really distinguish, you know, sort of what is real from what is a customer kicking the tires or checking out multiple points of interconnection for viability. But, you know, even if, let's say, 10 gigawatts of that ultimately gets built in the next few years, on a system the size of ERCOT's, that's that 80,000 number, that's a pretty significant amount of flexible load coming very quickly. And then there's more flexible load potentially in the traditional planning queues. We're aware of over 10 gigawatts of hydrogen projects. That data is from November, so that number has almost certainly grown since then. And then lastly, we're also aware of some smaller crypto mining loads that are falling below our large load threshold, but are going to behave as flexible loads on the system most likely. So a lot of change coming, very large amounts of load relative to the size of the ERCOT system as it exists today. So lots of impact. I'm going to quickly go through three kind of main operational challenges. These are probably the largest we're confronting, but not the only ones. Also, some of the proposed remedies that I'll talk about are just that. They're proposed at the moment. And there may be some changes as the proposed rules go through the stakeholder process. So just want to caveat there that I'm speaking on proposals, not necessarily adopted rules. The first one is voltage ride through. So as a concept, when there's a fault on the system, we see a depression of the voltage, and loads that are not designed to ride through that trip off and potentially can either create or exacerbate the reliability problem. Frequency instability and voltage instability are the biggest concerns. And we've actually been experiencing some events of this type where we've had a fault on the system, we've lost a large amount of load, and the worst one was in December of last year. We lost about 1,600 megawatts of load due to an electrical fault on the 138 system. Mix of types of load, but really the big takeaway is that last bullet. The system frequency jumped to 60.235 hertz with 1,600 megawatts of load tripping off. Now, that wasn't enough to cause over frequency relays to be a concern, but if we start to imagine that load scaling on the system, if we start to lose large amounts of load due to electrical faults, that becomes a real reliability issue. And if we think about addressing that, in the past, sometimes load tripping off during a fault was generally considered to be good, because any load that tries to maintain a constant power consumption is just going to draw more and more current through the fault condition, and that's going to make the low voltage problem worse. So we thought, in the past, that was a good thing. Now we have a lot of these voltage sensitive loads that are likely to trip off, and the system strength is getting worse as we have more inverter-based resources online, wind and solar. And so now we're in a situation where a single fault event might cause us to lose thousands of megawatts of load at once, and that leads to that frequency instability problem. So we've proposed a couple of ride-through requirements to address this. This would be applying to those large loads that I talked about earlier. I'm not going to go through the table, but just as a conceptual level, large loads will be required to ride through this table of fault conditions that they might experience, and to have relays that would allow them to do that. And then the other piece of the proposal would be that loads that are primarily power electronics or variable speed drives would be required to use constant current control and not constant power, so that they don't draw in a bunch of excess current and exacerbate the low voltage condition. So those are proposed, but that's how we're looking at that. Next topic I want to address is actually kind of a subset of the one I just talked about, which is price sensitivity and frequency control. It's sort of a less extreme version of the ride-through, but the end result is the same. So rather than seeing a frequency spike due to an electrical fault, we're now seeing it due to sort of normal operating behavior. I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of large flexible loads today they don't participate in ERCOT's security constrained economic dispatch. So that means that they are essentially watching prices and then varying their consumption kind of whenever they feel like, and without any coordination with ERCOT. That's problematic on its own, but it also means that their behavior is not incorporated into the economic dispatch when it's sending out generator base points. So potentially, if we see a large spike in price, potentially due to something like a generator trip, it can trigger hundreds or thousands of megawatts to self-curtail very quickly. And that's not in any way accounted for when those base points are issued. So I have kind of an example just to talk through. This is, essentially time We've got the blue line is the load zone price. We're in a load zone. This is all, by the way, just to illustrate the concept, it's no real data here. And we've got a bunch of flexible load with sort of varying strike prices. We can kind of imagine these are likely crypto mines. They're all kind of in the same kind of band of strike prices. And during just a normal day, we experience a large generator trip. On the next sched interval, the price spikes as the system's trying to ramp additional generation to cover what was lost. And as the price spikes quite high, what happens next? Well, we have a bunch of price sensitive load on the system. The prices spike above their strike prices. And so we see that flexible load begin to self-curtail. Now, the first issue that we see with that is, well, okay, how fast is that load curtailing? Well, we know for crypto, it can be done very quickly. Certainly within the next sched interval, we could see that load completely curtail. And if we have a large number of these crypto mines or other flexible load on the system, we could be talking about thousands of megawatts now. And, just for some sense of context, our frequency bias is about 1,000 megawatts per tenth of a hertz. So, every 1,000 megawatts that comes off, we could expect to see up to a tenth of a hertz frequency rise. And right now, ERCOT's only procuring about 325 megawatts of reg down on an average day. So this is going to far exceed any frequency regulation control we've got. So just kind of by definition, we expect the frequency to rise. That brings us to kind of problem number 2. It potentially creates a situation where we start to see price oscillations and generator oscillations, or oscillations in the generator base points. So after those loads have self-curtailed, remember, sched doesn't have any knowledge. So it sees on the next run that it has way less load it has to serve. And that puts it back down the bid stack and the generation side, the price drops. Well, that just incentivizes all those loads to come back on, which, if they can do it within 5 minutes, is probably just going to drive the price back up again. And we could very quickly end up in kind of a repeating pattern. And by the way, also, these swings in price are likely accompanied by swings in frequency, because again, we're not accounting for it in the economic dispatch. So that's not optimal for grid operations at all. So what do we need here? Well, working for the grid operator, the simplest answer is we need as many of these loads as possible to participate in sched as controllable load resources. And ERCOT sees this as kind of a benefit to everybody. These customers are still free to define their strike prices via bid to buy curve. It's just submitted to ERCOT and brought into the dispatch. They're eligible to provide AS, so that becomes another revenue stream. And there's potential other pricing and settlement benefits that we're looking at proposing. So, we see there are potential incentives there. And then for ERCOT, the biggest benefit is coordination. Bringing them into the dispatch means that behavior becomes coordinated with the dispatch of generation. So that's very valuable. It also aids in forecasting and reliability studies, which is something I'll talk more about tomorrow, because load resources have to provide more data. So we have a better insight into their behavior and what's driving it. And then lastly, again, we have a bigger pool to draw from for procuring AS. So that's, again, beneficial. So this is the optimal solution. There will likely be loads that either choose or cannot become controllable load resources and participate in sched. In those cases, there's probably going to need to be limits on that ramping behavior to address the concerns I just mentioned. And likely we'll need additional telemetry and registration data to aid in our forecasting as well. The last topic, and I promise it's short, it's only one slide, lack of good information. This is sort of something I'm going to harp on a bit more tomorrow. This problem is still relatively new. These really the last 2 years have been when we've seen this uptick in these new types of load. And because of that, there's still a lot we don't know. In the interconnection phase, we don't have good ways to weed out the sort of kick in the tires projects, and also tracking how the load grows over time after we've approved it. In operation, I already talked a lot about a lot of that pricing, price responsive behaviors happening outside of sched. So, we're needing it to be brought in so we have a better understanding of how it, and also coordination with grid operations. So I'll just close with the thought that I presented a lot of challenges. I think some of these solutions, we really see if these solutions can be implemented, load can become a tool to aid in grid reliability. I think the direction we're if we have a business as usual in the direction that I've kind of presented here, that becomes more of a reliability risk. But I think there is really a pathway to make it more of an asset to grid reliability. So, that'll feed into the forecasting discussion tomorrow. But with that, we'll finish and end for questions.